Thank you, everybody. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Baroness D'Souza. She is the former Lord Speaker, and she's going to talk to us today about a new role for the House of Lords, and just generally about the House of Lords and everything going forward with Brexit and various other issues. So it should be a really interesting talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Ben. This is my first visit ever to Warwick University, though I've heard a great deal about it, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I have to say, I had no idea it was so beautiful and so lively. I mean, it's a village all of its own. So please forgive me. I'm recovering, but I'm well. What I want to do today, this evening, is to talk a little bit about what the House of Lords does, because there is a perception about the House of Lords that it's basically a place where there are a number of aged white males with red dressing gowns sleeping on the benches, and I really want to try and persuade you that there's a little bit more to it than that. I want to talk about who does what in the House of Lords and how it does it, and then on to the role it could and should play in the kind of deep and widespread constitutional difficulties that Brexit brings. I was saying to Ben earlier that, this is, if you're a student of politics, this is the time to be a student of politics, because we are faced with constitutional threats which are unknown, unprecedented in this country. And I want to explain what those are and why they're there, and maybe even what we can do about it. So, what is the House of Lords? The House of Lords is a group of unelected people, as you know. We can maybe talk about that in the discussion. It's in desperate need of reform. And its major function is to revise and scrutinise legislation. And why is that necessary? Why is that a job worth doing? What tends to happen is that, particularly at the beginning of a new administration, that there is an avalanche of new laws. All governments come in and they want to sort of make the world better for everyone, and they know best, and so they bring in a huge amount of law. And the House of Commons simply doesn't have the time to be able to look at all this draft legislation in great detail, line by line. They have what is called, and you probably all know this, a programme motion, which means that a certain amount of time is allocated to particular bits of legislation, and when you come to the end of that time, that's it. No more time is allocated to it. It just goes through, and it comes then to the House of Lords. So we often get really sort of very, very complex draft legislation. Sometimes even it's that thick. Perhaps, 3/4 of it has not even been opened. The ribbons haven't even been untied, let alone scrutinised. And so the danger is that we could pass onto the statute books a whole raft of law which is contradictory with existing legislation, which infringes individual rights or liberties. So the House of Lords doesn't have a programme motion. It takes as long as it takes, and it goes over that legislation bit by bit by bit, mostly in committee. It's very long, it's extremely boring work, but someone has to do it. The House of Lords also is able to, from time to time, introduce themes and subjects which are politically too contentious to deal with in the House of Commons, which is so politicised. House of Lords is less politicised. So, for example, there's been a persistent attempt in the House of Lords to deal with assisted dying for the terminally ill, which is a hugely emotive subject, but it's one which the House of Lords does tend to tackle, and it tends to inform, not guide, but inform government policy. It at least alerts the government to the fact that there are concerns about things such as assisted dying. Also, we had a very major debate and eventually legislation on stem cell research, dealing with 14-day-old embryos, which, as you can imagine, has enormous religious and moral and ethical issues surrounding it. The House of Lords does not have the power of veto. This is entirely appropriate. It is an unelected House. So it doesn't have the power of veto. What it does have is the power of delay. It can ask the government to think again. And that can be quite an important power from time to time, but I'll try and explain that as we go along. Now the next then issue is who does this work? Who does it? It's a very contentious subject at present because the short answer to that is far too many people. The issue of the House of Lords is one which is absolutely in flux. It needs vast reform, radical reform. It's not happening at the moment because nothing happens except Brexit at the moment, but in due course it may well happen. But that's a sort of a frivolous remark somewhat. And it concerns more the reform of the House of Lords than actually dealing with the people who go in for this scrutiny and revision of legislation. All parties are represented in the House of Lords, not always equally. Until about 2000, the Tories had an inbuilt majority, in part because of the hereditary peers. And then Tony Blair came along and he introduced the 1999 House of Lords Reform Act, which got rid at a sweep most, all but 90, of the hereditaries, about sort of over 1,000 of them. And then he started filling the House with life peers. But at the moment, for the first time in history actually, the government of the day does not have a majority in the House of Lords, nor does it have a majority, as you know, in the House of Commons. So watch this space. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult for the government to get its legislation through. As you know, in the House of Commons, what the government has done is to have an arrangement with the DUP, the Democratic Unionists from Northern Ireland, in order to try to see that some of this legislation get through. So the lack of a majority means that things are very much in a state of flux, and in a way, that's very difficult for the government, but it's extremely interesting for students of politics, which I include you all in. Now, in addition to the party political peers, there are the non-affiliated peers, the crossbenchers. There's a group of about 200, so it's quite numerous. And these people who don't have any party affiliation, and they are appointed by an independent House of Lords Appointments Commission, which again is, has all party representation plus independence on it. And basically the people who are appointed through the House of Lords Appointments Commission as crossbenchers tend to be those who have themselves become extremely distinguished in their various areas of expertise. And that's a very broad area of expertise. So it's medicine and law and philosophy and psychology and education and sociology and rural planning and the built environment and playwriting and a very huge range of people with different sorts of expertise. And all of them have sort of lived life. It's not as though they've been, say an individual like one of you here who goes on after your course and goes into a think tank, which reflects the party of your particular persuasion, or goes to work for an MP, and then you decide you're going to look for a seat, you become an MP, and then you go into politics. I'm kind of against that. I think sort of, have a life, get a little bit of a life before you go into Parliament, and in fact, that's on the whole what crossbenchers tend to do. We also have 26 bishops who serve until 70, and then, but all the 9 major religions in this country are represented in the House of Lords, and we've got one or two UKIP members as well. Let me move on to how do we do our work? What are the mechanisms by which we? There are a huge variety of mechanisms. As you know, we have bills, and bills go through the various stages. The first reading is formal, second reading where anyone can say anything, and often they do, and at length. And then you get committee stage, and then you get report stage, and you get third reading. So all bills go through those various processes, both in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. And in the latter stages, what can happen is that any individual can table an amendment to change the law, and then that is discussed and debated and eventually voted on. But in addition to the sort of, the traditional business of dealing with draft legislation, there are any number of ways in which the Lords and indeed the Commons work in order to try to have a debate about areas of concern to either the constituents of MPs or reflecting the interests of the of various peers. We've got select committees, we've got standing committees, we've got sessional committees, We've got oral questions, we've got written questions, we've got private members' bills, we've got urgent questions. All of these mechanisms have different rules of procedures, but basically they are a way in which the individual in the House of Lords can alert the government to what their concerns are, and indeed to ask the government questions and to hold them to account. Now, ministers, as you will all know, are terribly good at avoiding answering questions. I mean, they're wonderful. They could get Oscars for it. But the thing is that if you are persistent enough and you go on and on, let me give you an example of that because I think it is quite an interesting example. Ruth Renville, who was a crime writer, somebody who will know who she is. Very sadly, she died about 18 months ago. But she was a Labour peer. And about 8 or 9 years ago, she decided that what she was going to do was to alert the wider world, the government and the wider world, to the horror of FGM, female genital mutilation. And so she began standing up at every possible opportunity. And one knew that when Ruth stood up, we knew what she was going to talk about. And everyone was sort of slightly hiding behind their hands and not knowing quite what to say about it. By the time she'd been at it for about 6 or 7 years, there were debates in the House of which the majority of speakers were actually men. I mean, fusty, dusty old peers who stood up saying, this is disgusting, we mustn't, And then there was eventually legislation. So it is possible with persistence for those who have a real concern about something which is, after all, a fundamental human right, women's rights, to make a difference by insisting that this subject is both discussed, and eventually there is such concern about it in the wider public that it becomes part of legislation. So I wouldn't sniff, as it were, at the kind of mechanisms that are available to the Lords in order to push business forward. The ad hoc committees that we have, which mean what they say, they last for a year, a session, parliamentary session, and they are on specific topics. And for example, in the last 2 years, it's an innovation. It's something that we all demanded we should have, these ad hoc committees. We've dealt with sexual violence against women, US extradition laws, the Arctic, revision of the adoption laws, things like that which people have a particular interest in, and they can call in experts from outside and they can take evidence and then they present a report to the government. The government doesn't necessarily act upon it, but again, it is a guide to what the public is concerned about, and it provides a very well-researched background upon which legislation can be built. So those are valuable mechanisms. And then, of course, we have a Science and Technology Committee, which is very highly regarded. It considers and reports on highly difficult and different aspects of research, such as regenerative medicine, stem cell research, flu pandemics, climate change, nuclear energy in particular. And we also have a committee, a European Union committee, with 6 subcommittees which have dealt with in the last 40 years every single aspect of legislation that comes from the European Union. Foreign affairs, home affairs, trade, law, human rights. And the reports that these committees produce, again, very often by people who are experts, are very widely regarded around the world, but particularly in Brussels, where they're translated into all the EU languages, because none of the other parliaments produce reports of this quality, this length, or this depth. So again, I don't really want to sell the House of Lords to you because I'm quite a critic of it, but there are things that it does which are good and useful, and which I think probably we would be in poorer shape without them. How does it happen? Well, it happens by amendments which are tabled, and the government has 3 choices. When you table an amendment, so saying, I don't like this phrase in the law, I want you to change any to must, or should to must, or any to all, minor, because line by line. And the government is sort of primed to say no to almost everything. That's what governments do. But it has three choices. It can accept an amendment, it can reject an amendment, or it can arrive at a compromise. And the compromise is usually a kind of fudge. And that means that the government comes up with a sort of a wording which kind of incorporates some of the intention of the person who's tabled the amendment, but it puts in its own words. It's a face-saving mechanism. But what happens if the Lords digs its heels in? As I've already said to you, of course, it doesn't have a veto. What happens if it digs its heels in? Well, ultimately, as again most of you will know, the 1911 Parliament Act, which came into being because Lloyd George at that time wanted to get a budget passed and the Lords blocked it. And so he introduced the Parliament Act. And the Parliament Act actually says that it is possible for the government to go ahead with its own legislation in the absence of acceptance by the Lords, but it will be delayed for a year. Does anyone by any chance know, you being politics students, what was the last time that the Parliament Act was used? Anyone know? It's very rare. The Hunting Act in 2000, you knew it, did you? The Hunting Act in 2001, because the Lords dug its heels in, I mean, in a way, possibly predictably, it dug its heels in about the Hunting Act, and then it was sort of Parliament acted, so eventually after a year, it sort of got onto the statute books. But there have been notable occasions when the Lords have dug their heels in and the Parliament Act has not been applied. One example of that, and I think it's a good example, is that this goes back a couple of years, a few years ago actually, during the Labour administration, and the government introduced an anti-terrorism bill, and one of the clauses in that bill was to increase the number of days that someone who was suspected of terrorism could be held without charge. Now, as you all know, that to detain someone is a huge infringement of an individual's liberty. It's a very major sanction. And there's got to be good reason why you would detain someone. In this country, I think that it depends both on what they think that the charge should be. But it's about between 12 and 14 days that at present you can hold someone without charging them. And what the government wanted to do was to increase that to 42 days. And the reason why they did that is they said because in this day and age of terrorism, which is so amazingly complex, and because it involves so much sort of international encrypted computer material, that they needed that amount of time in order to be able to gather the evidence necessary in order to detain someone. And the House of Lords was really cross about that. On the whole, they tend to try to protect individual liberties. And the people who stood up and remonstrated against this clause in this anti-terror bill, one of them was a woman called Eliza Bellingham-Burrough, who was the erstwhile head of MI5. And another was a guy called Paul Condon, who was erstwhile chief of Metropolitan Police. And another was an erstwhile law lord. And they argued very vociferously that there were, in their experience, which is after all put together quite considerable experience, there was no justification for increasing pre-charge detention to 42 days. It's already one of the longest in the democratic world. Obviously, in the non-democratic world, you can hold you for a lifetime, but in the democratic world, it's already quite a long time. And so this clause, this amendment, went back and forth between the two houses, because after all, everything that is agreed in the House of Lords, and people voted very strongly, to drown out this particular clause, has to go back to the Commons. And then the Commons said no, they insisted on it. So there was what we call ping pong. It went back and forth between the two houses. And Parliament, in quite unprecedented, sat for a continuous 40 hours, people sleeping in the corridors, because they didn't want to come to the end of it because there was no agreement. Eventually a compromise was reached whereby someone suggested that there should be a sunrise clause. A sunrise clause means that every year that particular part of the legislation is again reviewed, and the possibility is always that it will be struck down again. In fact, all of that is now irrelevant because we've got a new anti-terror law, but it was an example of what can happen when the Lords dig their collective heels in and says no to the government. The government can either use the Parliament Act, but they use that very sparingly, and also they have a sort of an eye to the, sort of the public concern that there might be, because you know the public do watch some things like this. Anyhow, now another occasion which was on the stem cell research. You know, those, as I said to you before, stem cell research, regenerative medicine is a major issue. The UK is a leading country in stem cell research, and in fact, in the House, we've got two of the world's experts who actually sit as peers in the House, and so, of course, they argue very strongly that it should continue. But there was a very large contingent of people who felt that, you know, to actually grow embryos for the purpose of experimenting on them and then discarding them was a little bit too far. So there was a really major debate about it. It went on for hours and hours and hours. But eventually the people who themselves are involved in that research argued that, you know, the only way in which we can begin to tackle some of the genetically derived diseases is through stem cell research. And since we had the leading edge in this, that it should continue. And eventually it was passed, and even the bishops agreed that this should go ahead. So that's another example. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I really want to talk to you now about something else, if you could bear it. Are you with me? Yes? Nearly. Oh, I want to describe another kind of legislative business that the Lords deal with. It's variously called secondary legislation, statutory instruments, orders in council, executive orders, delegated legislation. And for the sake of clarity here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to this collectively as secondary legislation, okay? Secondary legislation, SL. Within any draft bill which aims to create policy, the so-called parent or framework bill, there'll be a number of provisions that determine minor matters to do with implementation which have only a temporary effect. For example, the Highway Code was enacted via secondary legislation under the main transport parent bill. It gives ministers the flexibility to change the law as circumstances change, and it's more convenient for them to legislate with less parliamentary scrutiny. Given that here we're talking about very minor issues, such as which local tax office should be responsible for collecting parking fines, or rules for fishing boats, or bylaws, secondary legislation is subject to far less scrutiny than ordinary bills. So SL, secondary legislation, is generally not amendable. It is either accepted or rejected. So it is merely a mechanism for governments to introduce ways in which that particular bill, the parent bill, can be actually implemented. Given the lack of rigorous scrutiny, obviously Parliament is pretty insistent that secondary legislation is in fact limited to minor matters of implementation. You would accept that. If more substantive policy-related matters become increasingly governed by secondary legislation, which we now know Parliament can't amend, then we're actually in trouble. We're in trouble. And before giving you some examples of this, let me add one further aspect, the so-called Henry VIII powers. Does that ring up? Yes, people are nodding, some of you, yeah. This is where the government, I mean, it's pretty obvious where it comes from, Henry VIII, yes. This is where the government exceeds its powers by using secondary legislation to change existing laws or acts of Parliament, which are already on the statute books, so-called primary legislation. And I'll come back to this in a minute. So secondary legislation that comes before the House is either accepted, maybe very regretfully, or, if voted against, it falls. This is extremely rare. And there have only been a handful of occasions in the last 40 years when the government has been defeated on secondary legislation. For example, in 2007, the government introduced secondary legislation to deny support to welfare claimants at first-tier tribunals, and the House of Lords voted it down. I'll give you another example which is more up-to-date, and some of you may remember this. Last year, the government introduced, within the context of the primary legislation, which is the Welfare Reform Bill, it introduced a clause whereby child tax credits and working tax credits were going to be drastically reduced, if not eliminated, altogether. And they introduced this by means of secondary legislation. So, you know what the Lords was, it passed to the House of Commons. What we were faced with is either we accepted this, or if we rejected it, then hell might break loose. But during the course of the arguments, the Office for Budget Responsibility and another independent think tank came up with some very new evidence which had not been taken into account. It was George Osborne was Chancellor at that time, which showed that if these working tax credits and child tax credits were actually implemented, something like a further 650,000 families would immediately fall below the poverty line. And so incensed were people in the House of Lords about this that they decided they weren't going to accept this, and so they put it to the vote, and the government was defeated. And this was storms in a teacup, as you know, the Westminster bubble. There was a furore about it, so much so that the government appointed a very hefty senior politician to look into it and to write a report to see whether the power of the Lords could be further curbed. Well, already we don't have much power. And, thankfully and luckily, the report was made, and it sort of died a very quiet death because no one was going to accept that. But it's an example of the way in which secondary legislation can, on very rare occasions, be voted down. And it is, as I say, very rare. And governments do not like it one little bit. It's particularly important if secondary legislation is voted down by the House of Lords, which is an unelected house. Think about that. I mean, the unelected house thwarting, the manifesto views of the government. So, now the reason why I've gone into this in some detail, I'm getting to the end, okay? Because we now face Brexit. I expect you all know that. The Great Repeal Bill, or to give it a proper title, the European Union Withdrawal Bill 2017, to negate the 1972 European Communities Act, which raises a series of profound, wide-ranging and interlocking constitutional concerns, many of which are to do with secondary legislation. You may be a little tired of Brexit, but please don't be, because it is actually very important. The executive powers conferred by the bill, withdrawal bill, are unprecedented and extraordinary and raise fundamental questions about the separation of powers between Parliament and government. Let me quote one sober assessment which comes from the highly respected Constitutional Committee, which says, on clause that says, the bill invests the executive with deep legislative competence and presents a host of delegated powers that are breathtaking in both scope and potency. So if ever there was a need for Parliament to exercise scrutiny, now is the time. So let me go on to a little more detail about this. The European Communities Act is due to be repealed on the day we exit the EU. Sometime in March 2019, the government has not yet repealed the day, for perhaps understandable reasons, but what it means is that huge body of retained and EU-derived law, EU law itself, delegated law, directives, and EU-compliant clauses in existing UK Acts of Parliament will become null and void, unless all are immediately integrated into domestic law. The immediate result of this, and the absence of adequate new laws which have been agreed, and it's 18 months away, the immediate result will be uncertainty and ambiguity, which challenges the rule of law, by the way. Whenever a bill is unclear, the rule of law concerns inevitably arise. How do to deal with criminals. You know, what is the law and what is not the law. Individuals, organisations, and indeed the government need to know exactly what the law is without having to resort to legislation. It's a huge and complex area, even to grasp. Let me give you some examples of what the Great Repeal Bill has to deal with. Where will the Humberside fishermen be able to catch fish? The limits are clearly set by the EU, but they still pertain. If the EU laws no longer determines agricultural subsidies, what will take their place? And most importantly, in the developed nations, in the devolved, I should say, nations, will the decisions on these crucial matters once again revert to central government? This is a devolved power. Will it revert to central government? And clearly the devolved nations are very concerned about this. They don't want to lose power now that they've become devolved. What about nuclear safety regulations, currently regulated throughout Europe by EU law? Or how will pharmaceuticals be governed? What bodies need to be set up and established to allow, for instance, biologic drugs, which have a very clear, the time limit to be distributed? At the moment, that's all done through EU law. We will have to set up our own regulations and our own regulation body and our own monitoring system in order to be able to deal with the export and import of pharmaceuticals, including biologic drugs, which are crucial in the treatment of major disease. What new environmental provisions will be introduced and when? And what laws will protect confidentiality of information? How will the UK deal with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic? I mean, there is no answer that we can think of about that, but something's got to be sorted out. What trade agreements can be established and what body will mediate in any future dispute between the UK and the EU if the European Court of Justice doesn't no longer operate? Who's going to mediate again with disputes? So in theory, of course, all this can be dealt with, albeit time is extremely short. But my friends, the Great Repeal Bill is a framework bill. It's broad, very broad. It gives broad outlines only. The nitty-gritty of much policy legislation will be carried out by means of secondary legislation. And herein lies the rub. The Repeal Bill was always intended to cover the mechanical act of converting EU law into UK law. But the government freely admitted that ministers would have, and I quote, extensive powers to make such regulations they consider, regulations being secondary legislation, to make such regulations they consider appropriate to deal with any failures of previous EU law operating effectively or any other deficiency. This, my friends, gives the government a massive amount of power, including dealing with the rights created under EU treaties. For example, the creation of a public authority or even a new criminal offence would normally come about by means of primary legislation and therefore subject to amendment and scrutiny, normal scrutiny, but the Repeal Bill allows the government to bypass standard scrutiny and in the interest of urgency legislate on matters of the greatest legal and political importance. It is widely felt by people, politicians, by lawyers, especially by constitutional lawyers, and I hope by you that given the broad scope of powers, ministerial assurances are not sufficient, and that restrictions on these powers should actually be on the face of the bill, on the face of the Great Repeal Bill, and it should therefore be part of primary legislation. Secondary legislation should only be concerned with the necessary amendments to existing EU law, not to the substance of new policies and changes left open by the departure from EU law. The Repeal Bill does not, sadly, make this distinction, and thus the way is open for secondary legislation to apply to new primary legislation. And this brings up the Henry VIII powers I mentioned at the beginning or earlier in this talk. If the government can change primary laws, the Parent Act, the Framework Act, using secondary legislation, which as we know is subject to far less scrutiny, and thus without proper parliamentary oversight we are in trouble, my friends, we are in trouble. The relevant committee has said that the bill has Henry VIII clauses of a very broad nature. Parliament is understandably worried about this, and rightly so, and so should all of us be. We, as you know, have an unwritten constitution which has been developed over many, many centuries. It is very, very delicately balanced. And you know, certainly we went into this when we were talking about reform of the House of Lords. It is fragile. It works. It has grown up, and it sort of dovetails, and it works. But what it does is to regulate the balance of power between Parliament and the executive, and that's extremely important. That is the basis of democracy. We live in a democracy, of course we do. But this too, democracy, as you know, is a process. It's not a one-off, it's a process. And it's very fragile as well, and it needs constant vigilance. The tendency is always of governments to try to accrue more power. And they don't do this out of any sort of, nefarious reasons. They do it because they really think that they know best for people. And the job of the populace, as it were, is always to control the power of government. Because if you don't control it, it will take over. And this is really what we're talking about in this secondary legislation. It could democracy, believe you me, can disappear very, very quickly. It's a fragile thing. We have to be vigilant. So, my final paragraph is really to outline the minimum kind of scrutiny that Parliament should have here and now. We should have oversight, detailed oversight of the procedures by which the relevant committees scrutinise forthcoming secondary legislation, and that legislation must be strengthened and enhanced. The committees that look at it must be strengthened and enhanced. Each secondary legislation must be accompanied by a written ministerial explanation, preferably stating why it's necessary to have it as secondary legislation. The introduction of sunset clauses in the bill, which gives a time limit to the exercise of ministerial power. And in areas where changes to primary legislation are sought, there should be express parliamentary consent, both in the Commons and in the Lords. And my last sentence is, since Parliament will have to approve the implementation of all the legislation that's coming our way, it's surely in the interest of government to incorporate parliamentary scrutiny from the very, very beginning. This must include a thorough examination of all the secondary legislation embedded in the bill, and careful and thorough scrutiny of the informal discussions that are taking place, the formal negotiations, so that there is transparency, commitment to the democratic process, goodwill, and, with any luck, a relatively smooth transition in 2019. Without Parliament's role, with particular reference to the role of the House of Lords, we risk ceding much too much power to government and inevitable and lasting damage to parliamentary democracy. Thank you.
Very much. Are you all right to have a...
Yes, absolutely. I don't know. What time is it? I never know how long have I bored you for an hour? No. What?
It's like about 40 minutes, 45 minutes.
40 minutes? My gosh, that's a lot. I'm sorry.
If you're all right to... Any questions?
It's something I'm really, really concerned about.
You mentioned that you think it should be reformed. Is that in the way to remove non-electoral people from the House of Lords? How would you see that as being?
We're talking here about the House of Lords reform. What sort of reform would one... How long have you got? If there was a census done about 2 years ago, very wide, very respectable census, and they said one of the questions was, do you think that the House of Lords should be an democratically elected House? And the answer was overwhelming, 98% yes. And further down there was a question, should there be more elected politicians? And the answer was no. So, what's really difficult about this, and it's something I've been really involved in. In theory, you should have an elected House because it's involved in the legislative process. However, I've told you that we don't have the power of veto, and our power is extremely limited. If you had an elected House, you would immediately politicise the House. It would become as political as the House of Commons. And the last great sort of reform bill which came in under the coalition government, it was the House of Commons that voted it down. I mean, it was complicated because they did it under a programme issue, but nevertheless, they voted it down because they immediately thought, well, they're going to have competition in their constituencies. Supposing in a constituency award you've got a Conservative MP and a sort of, a UKIP or sort of Labour Lord. Where do the two meet? I think that I would rather have an appointed, let's get rid of this nonsense about lords and ladies. I mean, how stupid is that? We're all pretending to be aristocrats. We're not, I'm not. Most of them aren't. Why can't we be senators? I don't mind being an appointed senator. Being appointed on the basis of a certain kind of expertise, maybe, to make sure that you have in the House all the sort of expertise from the professions, law, medicine, philosophy, science, whatever, so that you've got that and people who really have demonstrated their expertise. But if you start electing them, you immediately make it political. And what you would get is an enormous amount of people who would put themselves up for election who weren't successful in getting in as MPs. And I just don't like the idea because I think it should be a body apart, which actually does have some wisdom and some degree of political neutrality in order to do its job of scrutiny and revision, which the House of Commons doesn't have time to do. If you abolished the House of Lords tomorrow, you would probably have to reinstate something similar. That could be a number of select committees, providing they had a degree of authority as well. I wouldn't mind that, but I don't think an elected House in a bicameral parliament is the answer. I could go on for a lot longer, but I'm not going to. Yes?
Maybe following on from your comment, do you think we should simply have a neutral House of Lords, which is simply a section of crossbench peers, representing different sections of society? I think I would suggest that, although we're probably moving towards a meritocracy increasingly in society, there is some sort of lament regarding the brushing aside, total sweeping aside of the hereditary peers and the replacement of that with peers who were sort of appointed with favours from certain political parties. And I think that hasn't necessarily balanced out the sort of meritocratic approach that they set out to achieve.
I couldn't agree more, and it's even worse than that in a way, because a number of peers who are appointed by the Prime Minister of the day are appointed for reasons other than their expertise. They're appointed for reasons, the fact that they have quite fat checkbooks, and they've been quite keen to open those checkbooks. And there are one or two people in the House who had very fat checkbooks, but who actually can't speak English, which, kind of defeats the purpose of scrutiny. And so, in a sense, the crossbenchers, as you rightly point out, have moved towards that, in that the people who get appointed by this independent appointments commission are people who, first of all, they look and see where the needs are. Do we need more philosophers, for instance? And then they try and sort of recruit someone. So we look at gaps. I would be inclined to say it would be nice to have a politically neutral House, because so much of it is becoming politicised, particularly since a lot of MPs are elevated to the House of Lords on all sides, on all parties, mainly because, for example, maybe they've given off their working life service to being backroom boys and girls working for the party, and this is a reward for them, which is fine, but that doesn't necessarily qualify them to be people who should scrutinise and revise legislation. So, I mean, I think that's it. And you know, I said right at the beginning that maybe that's going to change. One of the things that's going to happen in the next 2 years, if they ever get round to it, it was something I was negotiating when I was Lord Speaker, is that the Parliament's crumbling, it's falling apart, literally falling apart. It's very dangerous. And there's 3 options. You do nothing, in which case someone's going to get killed quite soon. Or you move everyone out, and you can get it done over a period of about sort of 7 years, and it'll cost about £3.5 billion, and Parliament meanwhile goes sit in where it sits, somewhere else in the park. Or you can do it bit by bit, which will cost about £27 billion and take 30 years. And of course, the majority of MPs don't want to leave Parliament, you know? I mean, it doesn't quite have the same cachet if you're sitting in you know, some modern block down Victoria Street. So, you know, I feel very strongly we should all move out. And that, to my mind, would be an occasion to go for quite a lot of reform. Some people feel that the Lords would never even get back. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Providing there's something that takes its place, you know. Yes, after this done.
One of the suggested ways to reform the House of Lords has, of course, been to reduce its membership. And I think this week, one peer suggested reducing it to as low as 300, which would obviously more than half its size. But do you think then there is a huge risk of cutting the expertise within the House of Lords for doing that?
Good question. No. I said 300 is a bit low. I did a sort of research exercise about 3 years ago when I looked at all the committees that we've got, what kind of contributions people made on the floor of the House, I mean, everything that we do. And I reckon that we, and this has been accepted now, that we could entirely adequately cope with 450. At the moment we have nearly 900. And it's a full-time House with part-time members. We welcome that. We've got, for instance, one surgeon who sits on the crossbenches, who's arranged to do most of his, a very, very well-fed surgeon, do most of his operating in the morning so he can attend the House in the afternoon. So what they're doing is they're bringing current expertise. It's not as though they're all retired about 300 years ago and are sort of living on. They're bringing current expertise into the House. That's what we need, because that's, again, a very cutting-edge area of endeavour. But 450 would be, and of course, the cost to the public purse would be halved. So, I mean, it's got out of hand. It's totally got out of hand. And I think 300 is probably too low in order to be able to deal with, as I say, a full-time House, which it is, it's very busy, but with people who maintain their careers outside the House, which I feel is a good thing. Okay? Yes? You
talked about the very poor separation of powers between the executive and legislature. Do you think we need a more powerful Supreme Court, certainly in times of constitutional...
Do I think what? The Supreme Court is what?
Do you think we need a more powerful Supreme Court, given times of constitutional crisis that we currently are experiencing?
Well, I mean, the Supreme Court only adjudicates on laws which Parliament makes. So I'm not sure how you can give it more power. I mean, what's interesting in your question is that you will know the Gina Miller. You all know the Gina Miller case. I mean, it was seriously the intention of the government, right at the beginning, to introduce the Great Repeal Act without parliamentary scrutiny. I mean, it's extraordinary that the government thought they could do that. And of course, David Pannick, who's a very well-known human rights lawyer who sits on the crossbenches, by the way, took this case and it went to the Supreme Court, to the High Court and the Supreme Court. And, you know, what the Supreme Court did was to adjudicate on the basis of existing laws as to what role Parliament should play in, you know, the law of the land. I don't know how you can give the Supreme Court more power if it's there simply to opine on the laws that exist. If you're suggesting, which you may be, that's probably, that the Supreme Court, or at least the courts, should adjudicate on the excess use of secondary legislation. That's an interesting idea. That's a really interesting idea. And it would be a very detailed constitutional case, which, you know, I mean, it would just be orgasmic for most constitutional historians. They would just love it, you know. But, I mean, I can see that that might be a possibility if the government tries to introduce. On the whole, the courts don't like to get involved in sort of the legislature. Why should they? You know, they don't want to get involved in between Parliament and the legislature. They want to stand apart, and I think that's important that they do. But it's an interesting thought that someone tries to bring a case saying, this is not what secondary legislation is for. I don't see any signs of that yet. Great idea. Maybe. Yes.
Do you think, as you're suggesting, if you had a more efficient, maybe more effective House of Lords with that part-time membership, etc., would you then suggest that if they used it responsibly, they could have more power in ways that you may describe now?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the law of the land at the moment, the way in which the procedures in the House of Lords and the powers that they have are circumscribed by, you know, bits of written constitution, can be that changed. I do think that the House could be more effective if it was smaller and tighter and more focused. Whether that would give it more power, I mean, the problem is, you know, is that if the House of Lords starts throwing its weight about and exercising power and, for instance, invoking much more use of the Parliament Act, you know, the electorate, and certainly the House of Commons, is going to get pretty fed up. And that, in turn, would probably introduce all kinds of bits of legislation to curb the powers. And we've already had an attempt at it after we sort of voted down the working tax credits secondary legislation. So I think that the laws, and again, it brings up this sort of, you know, the Salisbury Convention, which you all know about, which is that, on the whole, the House of Lords feels in its bones that any manifesto commitments should be honoured, and that we should never vote down manifesto commitments, because after all, you know, people have voted for a government and they voted on the basis of a manifesto. So, you know, that would be really going against what the vote of the will of the people, as it were. One of the interesting points that came up, which again is constitutionally interesting, is whether or not the Salisbury Convention, i.e. supporting manifesto commitments, operated during the coalition government. You know, where were the manifesto commitments? So there was a whole lot of new commitments that came up in the context of the coalition government, but they weren't manifesto. So people got very excited about that.
And especially now with less and less turnout as well. Does the manifesto commitment mean the same as it did in 1970 or whenever historical conventions?
In theory, in principle, it does. Yes. I mean, if the government says that it's going to introduce welfare reform, then on the whole, the Lords cannot vote against that. What they can do, what they did do, is to look at the Framework Act, to complain about it, to scrutinise it. But when they started using secondary legislation for the implementation, the way they were going to reduce welfare reform by reducing working tax credits, that's when, you know, they really sort of didn't feel constrained by a manifesto commitment. Yes?
What do you think is the influence of the Lord Spiritual from the House of Lords?
What difference do they make, do you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not a particularly religious person, and what has absolutely surprised me, I mean, favourably, is witches. I mean, they come in on a rota, so they're not all at the same time, because they've got their diocesan duties. On the whole, in fact, practically all of them, are surprisingly to me, amazingly attuned to the needs of their parishioners and their priests, amazingly involved in really nitty-gritty on-the-ground stuff in running food banks. I mean, a lot of the bishops, for instance, spoke about female genital mutilation, you know, a lot of them did. On the whole, I find them to be more than benign, actually quite strong in their defense of individual liberties and the rights of their parishioners. And I would say that they're a force for good. I've never come across any of the bishops, and there's about 4 or 5 who attend regularly, on a daily basis, they do a rota. I've only ever heard them come out loud and strong for things rather than against, you know. And so, but, I mean, you could argue that if they're represented, why aren't all the religions similarly represented in terms of numbers? We've got sort of, you know, we've got a couple of rabbis, we've got a Hindu, we've got Sikhs, we've got a proud Zoroastrian. We do have them, but they're not necessarily representative of their religions, because the Church of England is the state religion. So they're okay. Yes.
Do you think a lot of functions that the Lords do, like making better Acts of Parliament, could be done by the House of Commons that was elected with like a proportional representation system?
Yes and no. I mean, I think in a way what your question asks is, should the House of Commons be reformed? The answer is yes, absolutely, but far be it from me to suggest what those reforms might be. I think that the problem with the House of Commons is simply lack of time. I mean, they just don't have time to deal with their constituents and to deal with parliamentary business and to deal with all the committees they sit on. They simply don't have time. So, sorry, what you suggested, that if they were, what did you say?
So if the Commons was elected
On a party list system.
or like SCV, ALS, or more less one party dominating parliament, more pluralistic consensus politics with coalition.
There are so many different ways of, you know, sort of how the mix could come up, and the short answer to that is, I'm afraid I don't know. I've just come back from Serbia, where they have a party list system for their MPs. And of course the European Union is a party list system. And it seems to me, I'm very against the party list system, because what it does is it promotes the party and not the individual. And that in turn means that there's very little accountability. And it was absolutely obvious in Serbia, which is trying very hard to become a member of the European Union, that's trying to increase its democratic processes. But it's going backwards because of the party list system. Is that, you know, there is absolutely no accountability between the individual MP and his or her constituents, because there's no relationship between the two. So, I mean, I think you have to be very careful what kind of voting system you opt for, and what we've got at the moment is, goodness knows it's not perfect, but there's some which are worse. And I don't know what the outcome would be, because I think there's certain improvements. You know, there's this attempt now to change the boundaries, so we have fewer MPs, which again sort of, you know, begs the question, we have fewer MPs, well, why not a lot fewer House of Lords people as well? You know? Yes.
You kind of talk about the delicate balance of the unwritten constitution, and said how something like Brexit and the Great Reform Bill can kind of put it off kilter. Would you suggest having a written constitution, or would you like an unwritten constitution with a better separation of powers?
It's a very good question, I don't know. It's more likely that we're moving towards a written constitution, because if we incorporate all that EU law, of which there are many, many different kinds, but it more or less regulates everything that is done here, then it does in effect become written, because it's incorporated into domestic law. But when you have a constitution which has actually grown up over 800 years, I don't think you would ever get agreement in Parliament or outside Parliament as to what that constitution should look like. And when I said to you, well, you know, it's sort of, it's fragile, and it's sort of, you know, it's going like topsy, but it works. What remains to be seen is whether it will continue to work in the face of the kind of constitutional challenges which I've been talking about today. And it may be, you're right, is that it will have to become increasingly written because of that. I mean, you know, the changes that we face are so, we're all talking about sort of Mrs. May coming back from Brussels and the talks and whether someone's been nice to her or not nice to her, and there's a photograph of it. It is so profound what is going to be happening. Don't make a mistake. It is really profound. And if I were to come and talk to you in 3-4 years' time, that would be interesting. I'm coming.
Thank you.
There was someone there, yes, sorry.
Hi, as the former Lord Speaker, do you think that reforms needed in the House of Commons Speaker to ensure all 650 constituencies are represented in Parliament? So of course, like Burke can't vote on issues, so Buckingham just isn't represented.
Well, I mean, all 650 constituents are represented in Parliament, are they not? By means of their MPs being there. Do you mean do they get adequate access to debates?
Well, I mean, because Burke can't vote on issues because he's the Speaker, so they don't get represented in Parliament.
Oh, his constituents.
Yeah.
Burkers. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, no. John's, he at every election, he goes to the country, as it were, you know, it's in Buckinghamshire, his constituency, and traditionally he's not challenged because it would be unfair to challenge him. He does look after his constituents, he really does, and he goes there regularly. I mean, he goes at least certainly once a week. I think that's a kind of minor matter, you know, and on the whole they always vote him in. I think they feel that he's quite a good MP, and after all, if you know the criteria for voting someone in is familiarity with their face, then he's sure got that. You know, they know who he is. And you know, there's a lot of talk about sort of Bacco. I worked very closely with him when I was Lord Speaker, and he's in many ways very difficult. He's a great reformer. He's really changed things. He has given an awful lot of power to the backbenchers in the House of Commons, which has not been easy, and he's earned a sort of undying hatred of the government for having done that. But I mean, he's a good man, and I think, you know, his constituents recognise that. There was, yes.
Hi. I was just wondering, I think something that creates a lot of tension and apathy from the public for the House of Lords is the kind of expenses that you hear about, kind of like on quite expensive things that the ordinary person could never imagine spending for coming out of the public purse. How could that be like reformed and improved on?
This is an expenses question. Well, I mean, you're sure right to talk to me because I've been pilloried by the press, as you well know, for a number of occasions. I cannot stand here and justify the way in which a lot of the expenses regime has been abused, and it has been abused. What I can say is that every person in public office is bound to have their 15 minutes of Daily Mail horror. I mean, it's just, you know, we always talk about we pass the Daily Mail test. And I particularly had a lot of that about a year ago. It was unprecedented, and it was politically inspired because I don't really want to go into it, but I was making some unpopular moves in terms of trying to reform. And that sort of upset the apple cart. But the point is, and of course this happens all the time, the much more important point that you raise is, yes, what peers get is an allowance of 300 quid a day. And they get 300 quid a day if they attend. And we don't have a clocking in system, and so it is entirely possible, and indeed on occasions happens, that people come in, get their tick and leave, and then put in for their 300 quid. So they haven't really contributed to the parliamentary process. There are other people who spend 8, 9, 10 hours in committee, slogging through line by line, providing incredible expertise, and who change the law which affects you and me and all of us here. It's inevitable that you will get some people who will abuse the system. If you were to have a salaried, you had a salaried system, I think that would be even worse, really. I think what we need to do is to try to make it a lot more difficult for people to abuse the system. I mean, when it was directed at me, and it was really unpleasant, it was not a law speaker, and then, the Daily Mail was, oh God, she spent sort of 4,000 quid on flowers. Yes, I did have flowers in my office. And over 6 years, it worked out about 20 quid a week. But 4,000 sounds quite a lot to spend on flowers, does it not? Yes, I did keep a car waiting at the opera because the person who I was entertaining on a bilateral visit was the chairperson of the Federation Council of Russia, and their security demanded that we have a bulletproof car waiting for her at all possible, because the threats. So there are all sorts of things which one can justify. But, the point is, if the tabloid press gets their nails into you, they're not going to let go of them. That said, I think that things are changing. Next week, what's today? Next week, a report will be published, which has been chaired by a man called Lord Burns, who was an erstwhile head of a department in civil service, is producing a report on how to reduce the numbers of peers. I think that's something that we should go for, because that would reduce the public bill, and it would also ensure that perhaps those who are not contributing to their best, are eliminated from the pool, and therefore £300 a day for those who do put in a full day's work. Well, I don't know what you think. Is it unacceptable? Totally unacceptable? It's quite, of course, what you can do, you don't have to claim it, and lots of people don't. Or you claim half of it, 150, because you only spent 4 hours going for it, 8 hours. But I think that what we should do is get rid of the sort of the deadwood, and that would reduce the bill. But if you're talking about the actual principle of whether or not they should have an allowance, a lot of people come from, again, I don't want to be seen to be justifying this, but some of them live on the sort of, Rothschild, right up, and they have to pay for their food, their hotel. Travel is, they do get travel, train tickets or plane tickets. But they have to pay for a hotel, stay overnight. And in London, it's quite difficult to get anything under about 120, 150. Unless they've got a flat or they've got family or, they have to pay for all their food. So, in some cases, it doesn't always cover all their expenses, I don't want to talk about it anymore, it's too uncomfortable. Yes, someone up there. Yes, you. Yes, I think so.
As a research student of the history of the French language, do I need to be worried about Norman French in the House of Lords, for example, at prorogation, disappearing after Brexit?
La Reine de Velt. Do you have to be worried about it? You mean that it might go?
Will the tradition disappear?
It's possible. There's always a lot of laughter and giggling when, at the end of a session, and then they turn around and say, La Reine de Velt, the Queen wishes it for after each bill that's being passed, La Reine de Velt, Norman French. I quite like it, but it's not one of the raging issues of our time. But thank you. There's a lady there. Did you want to?
Give her one more question.
Yeah.
Let's go on.
You mentioned the devolved powers. I was wondering what you thought the
I mean, I think that it's going to have a very major effect on devolved powers. As you know, we've been through a sort of long and sort of serious history of devolution. And it's a major powers because, in a way, are the devolved powers going to take over the powers of the EU, or are the EU powers going to be given to central government? In which case, will central government simply follow what the EU has done in terms of providing agricultural subsidies, or will it not? And will the central government have the same kind of concerns about climate change and forms of sort of renewable energy? We just don't know. And of course, the big issue is the one between Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. I mean, I cannot in my wildest dreams see how that could be actually sorted out. But no doubt someone will come up with some kind of a fudge. But profound. And all that is going to have to be agreed. And it's going to have to be agreed in a hurry because, you know, what's happening at the moment, there are a number of businesses, like, for example, many will have heard this on the radio, all those people who produce food, okay? The majority of our food comes from the EU, right? And it comes over fresh and our lettuces and all the rest of it. And farmers here don't know whether they should be growing lettuces or beets or whatever, because they don't know what's going to be coming from the EU. And they work a season ahead. And they're in total flux. You know, what is the demand going to be? Where are they going to be able to make their money? Should they grow corn, wheat, beetroots, lettuces, flowers? Because we don't know what trade agreements are going to come between us and which, or indeed trade agreements that might be made with other parts of the world which would allow much cheaper, imports of sugar, for instance, in which case, you know, it would be a very sad farmer who grew sugar beet. It's so complex and so difficult, but certainly devolution is going to be a major, major issue.
But would you assume that the powers that Westminster is, for example,
Would I see that they're what?
to Scotland, for example, I think there was amendments to
Scotland is a much more devolved nation than the Wales or Northern Ireland, as you know. And I mean, there's always that possibility that Scotland will decide that what it wants to do is to become an independent member of the EU. How that would work, I have no idea. But no answer. Sorry. Don't know.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot of food for thought. So just a last thing is we do have, this event was sponsored by the New Statesman. So if you'd like to subscribe to the magazine, we've negotiated an exclusive subscriber offer for members. But thank you very, very much to, I'll say it even though you don't like it, the Right Honourable Baroness D'Souza. Sorry, but no, thank you very much.